Hello, my name's Olurotimi Osha. Today is June the 17th, 2026, and today I want to discuss the permanency of U.S. citizenship, both for naturalized and natural born U.S. citizens. By the way, I'm going to start with a disclaimer. I'm not your attorney. This does not constitute legal advice, and this is just for information only. I came across an article in the news about a US born woman whose parents are from Mexico. She apparently has dual citizenship. Um, and she was in removal proceedings. She was arrested last year as she and her sister were coming out of a Taco Bell. Her name, by the way, is Dulce Consuelo Morales. I hope I've pronounced her name properly. Dulce Consuelo Diaz Morales. So she and her sister were coming out of a Taco Bell in Baltimore, Maryland. And apparently, ICE had been, waiting, to ambush them, and so she was arrested, detained by ICE, and transferred over the course of 3 weeks from one detention facility to the other, and they put her in removal. She was in removal proceedings. It turns out that she was born in the United States. She was born in the United States, but she didn't have a passport, so she didn't know they were ICE, and so they were asking her to prove her citizenship, and she couldn't. By the way, 50% of Americans, half of American citizens, do not have passports. I noticed that African Americans, by the way, have started getting their U.S. citizenship, their passports, right? For a long time, Black Americans didn't have their passports, even though they were born in the U.S. And many white people in rural communities, because Americans don't travel out of America, but Americans have started traveling. So half of Americans now have passports. 50% of American citizens now possess passports, which is an improvement. In 1990, only 5% of Americans had passports. Only 5%. It's interesting. A Black American woman. In fact, she was the Auditor General of the Navy, and she ostensibly was my mentor, Miss Donjadelle Gilmore. She explained to me one day, she gave me her explanation as to why Black Americans intentionally refused to get passports. She said that they believed that there was a time that the U.S. government was trying to trick Black Americans into getting passports so they could ship them back to Africa. And I thought that was bizarre. I didn't respond to her, but of course that was illogical, and that didn't make sense at all. Because you getting a passport is a reason they can't ship you to Africa, because it's saying that you're actually an American citizen. And if America was going to deport somebody out of America, for instance, just as ICE and the government have been picking up and deporting people. They're deporting them because they don't have U.S. passports, right? You don't need a passport to be deported, right? They just carry you and ship you. You don't need a passport to be deported. So it was bizarre that the Auditor General, an educated woman, was actually telling me this. But anyway, that's not the purpose of this discussion today. What I wanted to do was talk about the circumstances, right? Under which, very limited specific circumstances, under which an American, naturalized or natural born, can be stripped of their citizenship. Of course, under it's been established, and I should do in other videos in discussing the cases, but in any event, citizenship is permanent, right? Citizenship is permanent, and it's not when you're a naturalized born citizen, right? If if you're a naturalized citizen as opposed to being natural born, that's been born here in the U.S. If you're naturalized, your citizenship is still not meant to hang like a sort of Damocles over your head. It's not supposed to put you on tenterhooks that any day now the government can question your citizenship, or any American-born person can question your citizenship. No, it's permanent. It's a benefit. It becomes a right, a benefit. That's done when the U.S. government official naturalized you and said, okay, hey, they gave you that certificate and said, okay, and and you took your oath. You're now a naturalized citizen. That's it, right? They're very unique circumstances, though, in which the government, if they want to denaturalize a naturalized citizen, in which they're required to first of all go to a federal court. A state can't say you're not a citizen, right? The state of Maryland can't denaturalize you because citizenship is a federal issue. It has to go through a federal court, and they have to go through a process in which you defend yourself. You have a lawyer, the government has a lawyer, and the government has a very high burden of proof. So the exception is when you obtained citizenship by fraud. So if the government can prove that, well, you deceived them, right? You deceived them to obtain that citizenship, and they didn't know. They missed something. There was something in your past, right, that they didn't know. For instance, if it turns out that, well, you came, right? You came from Russia. You were really a communist agent, a sleeper agent, and your objective was to steal secrets, right? To spy, to commit espionage or whatever, and to sneak in. And they didn't know that, all right? Obviously, when you were sitting before the immigration official and they were, interviewing you, because they interview you, they ask you, are you a criminal? They ask you all sorts of questions. Are you a member of the Communist Party? Are you, they ask you all sorts of questions. And so if you lied in those questions, right? And you were a member of the Communist Party, you were a spy, your objective was to sneak into the US, become a sleeper agent, and then to sabotage the US government, or, steal secrets then. And they find this out later on, right? So that's fraud. That's fraud. And the other thing is, that fraud, that misrepresentation you did in your application as you applied, in which you deceived the government official, right? It has to be material, right? So it can't be a trivial misrepresentation. By the way, you need a lawyer to be able to argue that, right? So a lawyer, like if the government were to ever pull you back, which is rare, right? But this administration has said, well, they're focused on denaturalizing people, right? So they're going to do it as much as possible, right? Again, your citizenship is a benefit and a right. It's not supposed to hang over a sort of Damocles over your head and put you on tenterhooks, right? So but the rare instance, it's very specific. One, you obtain citizenship by fraud, right? By making a fraudulent misrepresentation. So you came under a false identity. There's been a case, for instance, of a person who had actually been a Nazi, right, in Europe and had tortured people. So those people are barred, by the way. And again, there are always exceptions because the U.S. government, the CIA, helped former Nazis to get naturalized because the government wanted to use them as scientists to help develop our ballistic missile program. In fact, there's a case of a guy, and talking about a sleeper agent, there's a case of a guy, Jack Barsky, who was a KGB agent, right, from Eastern Europe, from East Germany, KGB agent. He snuck in as a student and all that. He became a naturalized citizen, married an American, had children here. He actually had a wife and kid back home. But nobody knew. He took on a new identity. He eventually exposed himself and went to tell the FBI who he really was and everything. However, they didn't revoke his citizenship. They actually made him a citizen because he wasn't a citizen before that. I think he was a permanent resident. But they now took him through the process and helped naturalize him because they saw that they could use him to help to understand KGB methods, because the KGB trumps the CIA in using sleeper agents. Those are people, I've done videos talking about sleeper agents. Those are spies, undercover spies who sneak into a nation. They're inactive for a long time, and so he helped the government, the CIA, the government to help to understand how the KGB sneaks people in as sleeper agents and things like that. So even though typically the government is not supposed to be helped to naturalize foreign spies, but the government can do whatever it wants, right? It can make an exception that, okay, they want to use you for national security. So those are the exceptions. Then and that's for naturalized citizens, right? So it can denaturalize somebody who obtains citizenship by fraud, right? But the burden of proof is on the government, and that fraud has to be material, right? It's not something, we could debate on what is material. Again, if you're a former Nazi who tortured people, but you came under another identity, that's, of course, that's material, right? So something very material. Or if you hid your criminal history, if you were if you were El Chapo back in your nation, a drug dealer and all that stuff, and then you come, you're lying. They ask us, the government asks you in your citizenship, the citizenship questions, do you have felonies? Are you a convicted felon? Are you wanted somewhere? And you're saying no, 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 and then they find this out later on. That's material, because the government does not want to. In fact, it's a disqualifier. If you're a convicted felon, it's a disqualifier, right? So those are the exceptions. So again, and that's it. Your citizenship. So the government, by the time they naturalize you, typically they're supposed to have closed the books. Like they knew, they knew, they did their investigations. They knew that, okay, this person is not a convicted felon. He's who he says he is, right? Before they naturalized you. That's why the U.S. process is very long, right? Because they watch you. By the way, they watch you. They monitor you. They use all sorts of stuff before they finally give it to you. So that's a rare exception. And for natural born citizens like Consuelo Dulce, Consuelo Diaz Morales, she was a natural born citizen. She was born here, but she didn't have a passport. Like I said, 50% of Americans today do not have passports, even though they're U.S. citizens. So she was in removal proceedings, which is illegal. She was born here because that was the government saying they didn't believe she was born here. But eventually she obtained a passport, and the government has dismissed the case. The charge, the removal proceedings have been dropped. So she obtained a passport. It's not a requirement for an American citizen to have a passport, right? She had a citizenship, right? She had a U.S. citizenship. So for people born in the U.S., the government can't revoke their citizenship, right? Unless that citizen, right, gives their voluntary consent. And there are cases that have established this, right? For instance, Afroyim, right? Afroyim versus the United States. That's a 1967 case. So Afroyim was a guy who was also Israeli. He had dual citizenship, and so he went to vote in an in an election in Israel. And so the government thought he violated the Nationality Act of 1940, right? And so they revoked his citizenship, and so he went to court, and the Supreme Court said no, that citizenship is permanent based on the 14th Amendment, right? Citizenship is permanent, and you can't revoke citizenship because of a crime. Because of a crime somebody committed after citizenship, it's not revocable. For those born in the United States, voluntary consent is required. And also for a natural born. Again, there's a narrow exception for a naturalized citizen. Very narrow, that, okay, they obtained the citizenship by fraud, and the government has the burden of proof. So citizenship is permanent. That's what the Supreme Court established. And that's Afroyim versus United States, 1967 case, that, citizenship can't be revoked because you committed a crime, right, after your citizenship. For instance, somebody who's been naturalized, or they're born because they killed somebody, they committed any crime, the government can't revoke their citizenship, right? They just go and lock them up in jail, right? Now, why would a natural born citizen have their citizenship revoked? For instance, somebody who's natural born, right? Who believes the United States should not exist, and they are sworn enemies of the United States. They say, well, that they think, they're going to work towards the dissolution of the United States, that the United States should not exist. So such a person would be constantly under surveillance by the U.S. government. But they have a First Amendment right to say that, right? They have a First Amendment right to say that. They're protected. But it's going to require government now violating their constitutional rights, constantly keeping them under surveillance. So, such a person so the government can't just strip them of their citizenship, because even though they were born here, even though they are at odds with the United States, they believe the United States should not exist, the government can't revoke their citizenship, right? The government cannot do that. That person has to voluntarily revoke their own citizenship. The voluntary consent is required. That's what the U.S. Supreme Court says, and that's Afroyim versus uh, uh, Afroyim versus United States, 1967. And remember, on the other hand, if for a naturalized born citizen, if the government is going to take a naturalized citizen to court, right, through take them through a denaturalization process. So denaturalization is required. They have to take them to a federal court, and the government has a burden of proof, right? Again, that's fraud. The fact that they obtained that citizen, the misrepresentation that the government is saying that they made, it has to be material. And there's a case that establishes that. That's Maslenjak versus United States. It's a more recent case, 2017, right? So it has to be material, right? Maslenjak versus United States. I'll do another video, maybe just analyze the relevant cases, right, themselves, because I enjoy discussing the cases, by the way. So in the case of Consuela Diaz, right, she was born here. She had her birth certificate, but she didn't have a passport. So her lawyer went to file for a passport, U.S. passport, because she was entitled to a U.S. passport, and she got her passport. So the Department of Homeland Security, they dropped the removal proceedings against her. It was dismissed. So that was, of course, the government had egg on its face in that case, because again, a United States, somebody born in the United States, the U.S. citizens, she was entitled to a passport, and she obtained her passport. She went through the process and filed for a passport. She had a dual Mexican citizenship, right? Many people have a dual citizenship. If the other country says it's okay, that's fine. Of course, and for people who are naturalized, normally, they are supposed to revoke their citizenship wherever. But again, America cannot prevent you from having dual citizenship, right? Unless the other nation says, you can't have dual citizenship. So they're both of them agreeing, right? So there are many people, for instance, born here, who are born in America, and the American citizens, they decide they want to raise their kids because of the cultural affinity, to have the cultural experience of the parents' home, and they raise them back home, or for economic reasons because it's expensive, or they want them to be raised in a certain way. Schools are very dangerous these days, right? There's sites for mass shootings and whatnot, unfortunately. So there are people who say, well, they want the safety of their parents' home, and they go and raise them until they're mature, and they come back to the United States, right? So it doesn't revoke their citizenship. Again, people who are born here, right, your citizenship can't be revoked because you've been living out of America for 30 years or 40 years, right? No, they can't do that, even if you're naturalized, right? Again, to revoke citizenship, it requires the voluntary consent of the citizen, right? That's Afroyim versus United States. It's a 1967 case. The citizen has to voluntarily consent and to revoke their citizenship. And there's a long process for it. You can't. So basically, that's it with respect to citizenship. It's kind of interesting because the way ICE has been picking up people. Again, one of the challenges is because America is a free society. There are people who are not citizens and have misrepresented themselves, and they haven't been able to prove it. Like there's a case of the Guyana-born Dr. Ian Roberts, who turned out not to have been a doctor anyway. He didn't have a PhD. And he was working in a job reserved for only citizens, right? He was superintendent of Iowa public schools in Des Moines, right? Earning $286,000. But he'd lied significantly. He was already in his immigration papers, and he was already in removal proceedings, and he had been misrepresenting that he was a citizen. Now he's accepted a plea bargain, and he's spending, he's imprisoned currently, and he'll probably be deported after he serves his prison term. However, in the case of this lady, Miss Dulce Consuelo Diaz Morales, it turned out she was born in the United States, right? She was born in the United States, and so she was an American citizen. The government didn't believe her, but she went through the process and filed for a passport, and she received a passport. The government dismissed the case, the removal proceedings. Again, for a natural born citizen, voluntary consent is required. There have been famous people who've revoked their citizenship, and people didn't know. Webb Du Bois, right, the famous Black American PhD from Harvard University, Webb Du Bois, right, soul of Black folk, very great person, founder of the NAACP. He revoked his citizenship, right? Many people don't know that he actually moved to Ghana, became a Ghanaian citizen, and he died in Ghana. He lived a very long life. He was a nonagenarian, lived into his 90s. I think he died at 95 or 96. But he revoked his American citizenship and he moved to Ghana. There were many civil rights activists, black people, who actually did that as well in the 60s, 50s, So in any event, I hope this has been helpful. Again, this does not constitute legal advice. My name is Olurotimi Osha, and I'll keep you posted. Thank you.